Okay, so you're prepping a talk on Philippians 2:12 to 13.
Yeah.
And you want to, go deeper than the usual stuff. You want something your audience will really remember.
Yeah, you want to give them something that'll make them think, whoa, I never thought of it like that.
Exactly. Something
Mhm.
new and fresh. So that's why we did a deep dive for you. Went through a ton of sermons, commentaries, you name it, looking for those hidden gems, the surprising insights that'll help your teaching stand out.
And one thing that really jumped out at us is just the sheer variety of approaches out there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like a lot of pastors are focusing on the whole divine empowerment versus human effort thing.
Yeah, classic. God works in us, but we have to work too.
Exactly. But they're finding some seriously creative ways to illustrate it.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Well, Shoal Lake Baptist Church, they use this analogy of a clogged drain.
Okay.
Like, we all know we should fix it, right? But actually getting down there and doing it, it's hard work. And it's kind of like that with living out our faith.
It's so relatable.
Right. I mean, everybody's dealt with a clogged drain at some point.
Exactly. It's relatable, it's kind of funny, but it also makes you think.
Yeah, it's not just about knowing what we should do. It's about the struggle of actually doing it.
Yeah.
And that's where the idea of God working in us comes in.
Because if it was all up to us,
Oh, we'd be in trouble.
we'd just stay clogged forever.
Another powerful theme that kept popping up was that idea of, living as light in a dark world.
Right. Makes sense.
But one sermon really stood out. Sherwood Community Friends Church used this analogy of a Navy ship navigating in total darkness, relying only on its lights.
Wow. That's powerful. Super visual.
It makes you really feel the tension and the danger.
And it really drives home the point, we're not just called to be lights for ourselves. We got to shine bright enough for other people to find their way.
It makes you ask yourself, am I shining brightly enough? Is my life helping others get through the darkness?
Right. Am I a lighthouse or am I just a flickering candle?
Now, here's a theme I found really interesting. The idea of unique callings. Darden Presbyterian Church had this cool take on it. They were talking about how each of us has this unique, 5% contribution to make to the world.
5%.
Yeah, something only WE can do.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because it reframes the whole verse. It's not about just doing generic good works. It's about finding and using our God-given gifts, to fulfill his purpose.
Exactly. It's not about being a carbon copy of someone else's faith.
It's about embracing, the unique way God made you.
And using your own strengths.
And that actually takes the pressure off, right?
Totally.
Because it means we don't have to be perfect or try to be like everybody else.
It's about finding your lane, running your own race, the one God has for you.
Let's talk cross-references, because these pastors were making some super insightful connections to other parts of the Bible.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One they're looking up a lot was the link to Ephesians 2:8-10. It's a good reminder that working out our salvation isn't about earning it, Grace comes first. Good works are the fruit of that grace, not the root.
It's like you're not trying to impress God or anything. It's about responding to his love.
Right.
Letting that love flow through us.
And another cool connection was with Matthew 5:14-16, where Jesus calls us the light of the world.
Boom. Suddenly the verse has a whole new dimension.
Yeah. Now it's not just about your personal relationship with God. It's about how your actions impact everyone around you.
Okay, you ready for this?
Yeah.
Because it's sermon illustration smackdown time. These pastors were bringing their A game.
Oh, they did not hold back.
Okay, lay it on me.
All right. So one pastor used this analogy of syncing our technology. Our devices work best when they're synced up, right? Well, we thrive when our lives are synced up with God's plan.
I love that. It's so relatable, and it takes something so ordinary like my phone and make it spiritual.
And then there was this incredible story about a Ukrainian powerlifter who disguised himself as a janitor.
Wait, tell me more.
So he shows up at this powerlifting competition looking totally ordinary. People probably thought he was there to clean up. But then he steps up to the platform and just blows everyone away.
Oh my gosh, what a visual. The twist.
It's like a reminder that God puts hidden potential inside all of us. We may not look like much on the outside, but he can do amazing things through us.
Okay, that one is definitely going in my sermon notes. That is amazing. And what's even cooler is that some pastors are using secular examples too.
Oh yeah, they're bringing in philosophy, literature, even health advice, stuff you wouldn't normally think of for a sermon.
Like what?
Well, one pastor brought in Soren Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard. Wow, okay. Deep cut.
Yeah, he used Fear and Trembling to explore the idea of, reverent obedience to God.
Adds a whole other layer to it, huh? Shows that faith isn't just about feeling good, it's about wrestling with big ideas.
And get this, another pastor used the American Heart Association's recommendations for physical heart health and used it to talk about spiritual exercises to cultivate joy. Brilliant, right? It shows that these truths from the Bible can apply to anything. Like, they go way beyond the church walls.
You know, it's amazing to see how all these pastors are connecting with people in new ways.
It's not just about quoting the Bible, it's about making those ancient truths come alive.
And that's what makes for a really powerful sermon.
Absolutely. It's about making a real impact. And we've got even more inspiring examples coming up in part 2, so stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into Philippians 2:12-13. It's amazing how much is packed into those few words, right?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that powerlifter janitor. Talk about hidden potential. Makes you wonder what other surprises we might find.
Well, one thing that really struck me as we were going through these sermons was the different ways pastors approached that whole work out your salvation with fear and trembling part.
Yeah, that part can be kind of intimidating, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not exactly a warm, fuzzy invitation.
Right. And some pastors do kind of lean into that seriousness, emphasizing how serious our commitment to Christ should be. But others take a more nuanced approach.
Like how? What do you mean?
Well, for example, Innovation Church pointed out that the fear and trembling shouldn't be taken literally. It's more like a sense of reverence and awe before God.
So it's not about being scared of God. It's more about approaching our faith with respect and wonder.
Exactly. Recognizing how amazing God's grace and power are and responding with humility, with a desire to please Him.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's not about cowering in fear. It's more about being humbled by God's love.
And that ties in really well with the idea of God working within us. Remember the verse says, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure."
It's not a solo mission, then it's more like a partnership. God empowers us, and we respond by taking action.
Precisely. And that's where the working out comes in. We're actively participating in the process of becoming more like Christ.
It's like that analogy that Word International Ministries Netherlands used, the one about working out at the gym. You don't just show up and magically get fit, right? It takes effort, discipline.
Yes. And just like physical exercise helps our bodies grow stronger, those spiritual disciplines, prayer, Bible study, serving others, they help us grow spiritually.
So it's not about just sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. We got to meet Him halfway.
Absolutely. It's about seeking Him intentionally and then letting His power work through us.
Now, another interesting angle came from Swamp Mennonite Church. They really focused on the communal aspect of working out our salvation.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Because it's easy to get caught up in that individualistic side of faith, just me and Jesus.
Yeah, focusing on my own personal relationship with God and forgetting about everyone else.
Right. But Swamp Mennonite Church reminded us that we're not on this journey alone. We need each other. They talked about how humility, obedience, faithfulness, those things are best lived out in community.
So it's not just about me and Jesus. It's about how my faith impacts the people around me.
Exactly. It's about supporting each other, encouraging each other, holding each other accountable as we all try to become more like Christ.
Yeah, and that brings us back to that whole idea of being light in a dark world, right? Like, if we're all shining brightly together, it's going to have a way bigger impact.
Oh, absolutely. There's strength in numbers. When we come together as a community of faith, we can really be a light for the world.
Okay, that's definitely something worth preaching about. Now, as we've been talking about all these different perspectives and illustrations, it's clear that there's no one right way to preach on Philippians 2:12-13.
Definitely not. Every pastor is different and every congregation is different. What works for one group might not work for another.
So it's all about knowing your audience right.
Yeah.
And finding those illustrations and connections that will really resonate with them.
And that's where the magic happens. When a pastor can take this ancient text and make it feel fresh, relevant, meaningful.
Yeah, you got to make it come alive. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, that there's no one right way to approach this verse, but it seems like there are a lot of wrong ways too. Like, are there any common traps that preachers fall into when they're teaching on this passage?
Oh, that's a great question. And yeah, you're right. There are definitely some pitfalls to avoid. One common one is turning Philippians 2:12-13 into a guilt trip. Putting so much emphasis on the work out your salvation part that people end up feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, like they're not doing enough, like they're constantly failing.
Exactly. And that's totally missing the point, because the point is not to burden people with a bunch of rules and obligations. It's about pointing them to the source of true strength and joy, and that's God.
So how do you strike that balance? Like, how do you emphasize the importance of effort without making people feel like they're failures?
Well, one important thing is to always bring it back to the "for it is God who works in you" part. We got to make sure people remember that God is the one who starts it all. He gives us the desire and the power to live out our faith. Our effort is a response to His grace, not a way to earn it.
Yeah, because if you lose sight of God's grace, it's easy to slip into that legalistic mindset,
Yeah.
that performance-based Christianity.
And another trap is making Philippians 2:12 to 13 all about outward actions, like focusing so much on what we do that we forget about who we are.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's easy to turn this verse into a checklist of good deeds, right? Go to church, volunteer, read your Bible every day. But real transformation starts on the inside. It's about cultivating those heart attitudes: humility, obedience, love.
So it's not just about doing the right things, it's about becoming the right kind of person.
Exactly. And that's a lot harder and a lot more challenging. It's about letting God work in our hearts and minds, transforming us from the inside out.
Because if we're just going through the motions, without a real change of heart, our actions are meaningless.
Exactly. And that's why we got to connect Philippians 2:12 to 13 back to the gospel. It reminds us that we're saved by grace, not by our works. And it's that same grace that empowers us to live lives that are pleasing to God.
So it all comes back to grace. Grace is the foundation. Grace keeps us going. And in the end, grace is where we end up.
Absolutely. And that's the message that every preacher needs to be sharing. Because when we really understand God's grace, it frees us to live lives of joyful obedience.
And that's a message that people need to hear. One of the things that really impressed me about these sermons was how creative they were. All the different illustrations and stories the pastors used.
Yeah, it's amazing how much variety there was. Pop culture references, personal anecdotes, scientific analogies, they were pulling from all over the place.
I loved that Powerlifter Janitor story, but there were so many other good ones too.
Like that pastor who compared the Christian life to updating a smartphone's software.
I love that one.
Yeah.
So relatable.
And then there was that one about comparing it to running a marathon.
Oh yeah, that was a good one.
And of course, who could forget the one about the American Heart Association guidelines? Who knew heart health could inspire a sermon? It just shows that God can use anything to speak to us.
And there's so many possibilities for illustration. We don't have to be limited to those same old tired cliches. We can draw inspiration from anywhere.
And that's what makes preaching so exciting. You're constantly discovering new ways to connect with people and to help them understand God's word.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about how all of these themes and illustrations connect back to the core message of Philippians 2:12 to 13. It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is. It's about living out our faith in a real and authentic way.
But it's also about recognizing our need for God.
Exactly. We can't do it on our own.
So how do we help people move from inspiration to action? How do we challenge them to take what they've heard and actually apply it to their lives?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's any easy answer. But one thing that stood out to me was the importance of making it personal.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of just talking about Philippians 2:12 to 13 in these general terms, we need to help people see how it applies to their own lives, to their own struggles, their own dreams.
Help them connect the dots between the text and their own experiences.
Exactly. And that might mean asking some tough questions, like, what are the clogged drains in your life? Where are you failing to shine your light? What's that unique 5% contribution that only you can make?
Those are some good questions. It really makes you think.
And it makes it more memorable, too. When people can see how God's word connects to their own lives, they're more likely to remember it and to actually do something about it.
So it's not just about giving them information, it's about helping them change.
And ultimately, that's what preaching is all about. It's about seeing people's lives changed by the power of the gospel.
Okay, I got to ask, out of all of these examples and perspectives, what stood out to you the most? What was your biggest takeaway?
What really hit me was how connected all of these themes are. It's like they're all pieces of a puzzle, and when you put them all together, you get this beautiful picture of what it means to follow Christ. We've talked about God's power, our effort, being light in the world, unique callings, reverence and awe, community, grace.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's also super encouraging because it shows us that God has given us everything we need to live a life that honors Him. We don't have to do it alone, we don't have to be perfect, and we don't have to rely on our own strength. It's all about letting God's grace work in us.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Makes me even more excited to see what other insights we uncover in part 3. Don't go anywhere. So we've been going through all these sermons and commentaries. I'm struck by how these pastors are really, like, thinking outside the box.
Yeah, it's not just the same old stuff, right? It's
Yeah.
about taking these ancient truths and making them come alive for people today.
Exactly. Like, who would have thought you could connect the American Heart Association to spiritual growth?
It shows that God can use anything to speak to us if we're paying attention. For pastors, it means being creative, drawing inspiration from unexpected places.
So, speaking of thinking outside the box,
Hmm.
what are some of the more, like, unusual approaches you came across in your research? Stuff that really stood out.
Let me think. Oh, one that was really interesting was a pastor who used the analogy of a jazz ensemble to illustrate unique callings.
A jazz ensemble. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, he talked about how each musician has their own unique part to play, right? But they come together to make this amazing harmonious sound.
I love that. It shows that individuality and unity aren't opposites. They can actually work together.
Exactly. And it also shows how important it is to appreciate what everyone brings to the table. Like, we need to be able to listen to each other's music.
That's a good word. Listen to each other's music.
Mm.
What else? What other, like, out-of-the-box illustrations did you see?
Oh, there was this other pastor who used the analogy of a sculptor to talk about spiritual formation.
Okay, I like where this is going.
He was saying that God is like the master sculptor who is slowly shaping us into the image of Christ.
Wow, that's a powerful image. And it reminds us that it's a process, right? Like, we don't become perfect overnight.
Exactly. It's about surrendering to God's work in our lives, letting him mold us over time. It takes time.
Patience.
And get this, one pastor even used a video game to illustrate that tension between, divine empowerment and human effort.
A video game. That's pretty creative. I bet the kids in the congregation loved that one.
He was talking about how in a video game, you have to make choices, take actions, but you also have to work within the rules of the game to succeed.
Yeah, you got to know how to play the game, but you also got to make the right moves.
Exactly. It's a great way to show how pastors can use, pop culture to connect with people in a way that makes sense to them.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about how important it is for pastors to be lifelong learners. Like, always growing, always learning new things.
Yeah, absolutely. The best preachers are the ones who are always curious, always digging deeper.
Because if we're not growing ourselves, how can we help others grow?
Right, exactly. And that means being willing to learn from anyone. Other pastors, theologians, writers, artists, people from all walks of life. Because God can speak through anyone.
If we're willing to listen.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Philippians 2:12-13, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from all of this?
Well, I hope they'll be inspired to, approach this verse with fresh eyes, to really dig in and see what treasures they can uncover.
And to remember that it's not just some ancient text. It's a living word that can change our lives and change the world.
So go out there and preach, teach, share this verse with passion and creativity. And don't forget to rely on God's grace every step of the way.
Because the world needs to hear this message now more than ever.